Everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 23rd of February, and tomorrow it's going to be the 24th of February, meaning it's going to be the 1-year anniversary of the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is really just crazy. The year went by so fast. I remember last year, February 24th, 2022, when this all began, when the Russians, they crossed over the border in Crimea specifically, and they launched all of those bombing raids, like especially against Kharkiv and other cities. I was just watching it live, and then I just began mapping it, and I haven't stopped ever since. So that's pretty crazy. But yeah, it's been a year. Let's focus on today now, and tomorrow we'll talk about the situation tomorrow. But let's get into this. First of all, I want to talk about the situation around Vuhledar, because there are some pretty significant changes since the last time I talked about it. And I would love to go more in depth about it, because really the situation here has been really interesting, and they gave us a lot of insight into both the Russian and Ukrainian military doctrines and how they're carrying out their operations. But just as a general summary, we know that the Russians launched some sort of attacks, assaults along the Vuhledar front, into taking the city of Vuhledar, and it started about a month ago, beginning of 2022. And so these assaults, first of all, they were aimed at taking the rest of Mikhailske, which is this town over here. And the Russian units were successful at this, and then they began launching assaults onto the dachas that are to the east of Vuhledar. And the issue is that the Ukrainians, they are in these fortified high-rise apartment buildings. Some of them are 5 stories, some of them are 9 stories. And they were able to easily hold on to their positions despite the Russian artillery firing upon them. It didn't cause that much damage to be incurred by the Ukrainian defenders, and they're able to easily fire upon the Russian forces that were in this just like a totally exposed ground in the dachas in these pretty rural areas to the east of the town. And so they were not able to hold it for that long, and they were forced to retreat. And as a result, the Ukrainians had the ability to conduct a counterattack, and they fully secured all of the open fields in between the town of Vuhledar and the town of Mikhailske. And they took over some of the allotments that the Russians had taken over last month. They were using in the process of assaulting Vuhledar head-on. So, for instance, this allotment over here was taken back. And interestingly, the Ukrainians were able to really penetrate deep into the Russian line. They were able to take over some of the dachas, the rural houses in the westernmost part of Mikhailske, so this circle over here. And I don't think they're going to hold on to it for that long, because it really is a bridge too far. It is pretty deep into the Russian lines, but it does leave the Russians exposed on the flank, and it does mean that they have to pause all offensive activity in the direction of the dachas, for instance, or of the coal mine, until they can get the situation under control. And speaking of the coal mine is really what the Russians should have been assaulting from the beginning, honestly, because if you're able to take the surrounding heights in this general area, the circle that I'm going over right now, and you're able to take the coal mine, then first of all, you cut off most of the supply routes into Vuhledar from elsewhere, like from Marinka or from Kurakove, and then you have a very good firing position because of the slag heap over here that you could use to fire upon the Ukrainian positions in Vuhledar, which are on a lower elevation. The only thing that's really helping them is the fact that they have all of these high-rise apartment buildings. But it would be good to have a very good visual sight of it from a slag heap, for instance, or from the coal mine in general. And so that flanking maneuver would have been really helpful at the beginning of the offensive, when the Ukrainians were sort of caught off guard for the first 24 hours or so. Now it's going to be much more difficult to do that, but if Russia does want to take over Vuhledar, they have to. And talking about the other side of Vuhledar, we also have the situation in Pavlivka, where the Russians were forced to retreat to the river over here. Pretty narrow river, but it is now the line of separation between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. So originally the Russians were assaulting the Ukrainian positions in northern Pavlivka. You have I think it is a grain elevator over here, and you have some other agricultural enterprises that were taken over by the Russians. But really, what's the point of holding on to it when it is just very difficult to maintain, and there's not even an offensive going on anymore in the direction of Vuhledar at the moment? So the Russians just retreated across the river and are trying to consolidate their ground right now. They are probably going to try to attack Vuhledar later on, but at the moment, Ukraine's been able to stabilize the front line. and it means that their contingent is safe. So let's move on to the situation a bit to the north around Marinka, where again Russia is applying pressure to the north and to the south, but the Ukrainians are still holding on. Specifically, some of their air mobile brigades, 79th Air Assault Brigade, and you have the 2nd and 1st battalions of that said unit. They're holding on at the moment around some of the tire manufacturing plants, agricultural facilities, and then also to the north you have some agricultural facilities. But to the south, that's where we have the most updates. So the Russians, in tandem really with the DPR forces, were able to break through one of the main trench lines to the north of the town of Pobeda. So along this road that originally linked Marinka to Pobeda, you do have some trenches and you have some dugouts for firing positions for the Ukrainians. And they really shelled it very hard, the Russian troops, using their immense artillery advantage. They shelled it for many hours, and then they were able to conduct a frontal assault and overrun the Ukrainian positions over here. And so now it gives them some access to the northern flanks of Pobeda, which means that we could expect to see some attacks in the direction of the town in the coming days. And we might also see them going on to the east. And so this might be Russia's really first or latest opportunity at assaulting the town. They've tried to do it previously, but they've been pushed back every time due to Ukraine's fortified trenches that have really been difficult to overcome. So you could expect to see fighting in this warehouse over here, and then also in the town, which is a very small town, by the way. It's only like 4 blocks. But it is important because once Russia is able to take it over, if they are, then they could flank Novomykhailivka, which is a really big Ukrainian defensive node, where you also have the 79th Air Assault Brigade. And it would also lead to Russia being able to attack this entire chain of towns along the road connecting to Novomykhailivka, and also would allow them to approach the town of Kurakove, which is very important as a logistical hub, as a command hub. You have some artillery positions set up around the town, so it is pretty important. Now let's go up and talk about the situation in Bakhmut that I haven't really been able to cover because I've been away, but we do have some pretty interesting updates from here. So we know how the Russians were not able to break through at this forest that is adjacent to Ivanivske, because really they didn't have that much support from other units. The Wagner group, they just sent like their first echelon, their lightly equipped infantry towards the T0504 road, and they were able to secure it. But of course the Ukrainians pushed back, really sending in a lot of reinforcements in the direction to prevent a water breakthrough. And so the Wagner group just decided to retreat because they were focusing elsewhere. And so now the Wagner group has found a new way to bypass the Ukrainian defensive lines around Ivanivske and reach the road. But this time it is from a direction that is actually pretty close to Bakhmut. So you see this forested area over here. I'm going to go over its perimeter. You see this one over here. So the Wagner group was finally able to infiltrate it a few days ago. The Ukrainians had been holding out in the forest using some of their camouflaged equipment, some of their camouflaged uniforms, just to hold the line for as long as possible. But the Wagner group was able to break through, and now they are approaching the Ukrainian defensive fortifications that have been set up near this agricultural facility. And so you're going to see some fighting going on over there. You do have a lot of Ukrainians dug in over here, and if the Wagner group could dislodge them from their positions, then they would be able to take positions along the T0504 road, which would disrupt any sort of connection between the Ukrainian grouping in Bakhmut at the moment, the Bakhmut city itself, which I would estimate at maybe like 10,000 at the moment, maybe higher, and the Ukrainian groupings in Ivanivske, which if I had to guess would be maybe 1,000, 1,500, 2,000. And that would be the significance. It would also give the Wagner group a forward position to begin assaulting either Ivanivske from the east or Bakhmut from the west. So that is all very important at the moment. We also know that the Wagner group has continued to expand control over the residential blocks to the north of Opitny. And again, they are trying to link up with the Russian grouping and the Russian assault detachments that are fighting around the garbage complex. So if they could link up across this dam, then that would give them a more cohesive fighting block to continue the advance deeper into Bakhmut. So that's what they're trying to do right now. But obviously they're coming up against very fierce resistance from a number of Ukrainian brigades in the AFU, but also some other units and legions that are either more asymmetrical, some like reconnaissance or drone units, or they're pretty much foreign units like the Georgian Legion. There's also a Freedom of Russia Legion. There's a Jokhar Dudayev Battalion for the Chechens who are disaffected with the current Russian government. And so all of them are fighting in this specific area. Then if we go to the Zabakhmutka district, this is an area where Russia has had some pretty notable successes in the past few days. So what I think they're trying to do over here is cut apart the Ukrainian defensive grouping in eastern Bakhmut into 2 or maybe 3 different sections. So here's one section. This is the one in the northern Zabakhmutka district. And then here's another one, which is pretty close to the garbage waste sorting plant and close to the dam. And so I know this because the Russians and some of the Wagner assault detachments have been advancing along this specific spearhead, taking over a few blocks one by one as they begin to approach the Bakhmutovka River in this specific section. So once they reach it, then there will be no way for the 2 sections to communicate with one another. Right now they're doing it through some of these roads over here. That's how they're able to link up with one another for communication, for transport, for personnel, all of that. But if the Russians are able to reach the river, then they can't really do it in a sort of semicircle way, because all of the crossings across the Bakhmutovka River have been heavily damaged. Like here we have this video of Russia destroying one of the river crossings across the Bakhmutovka River. You can see it over here. They were firing it with their artillery. I guess the Ukrainians could probably cross over. They won't be able to set up a pontoon bridge, but they could cross over just on swimming across it, although it is very cold. But that is something that they could probably do. They could use some small boats, but again, they would be fired upon by the Russians. And this area where the river is located is in more of an open area, lower elevation, so it could become a sort of a killing zone. Either way, separating the Ukrainian groupings is looking like the Russian strategy, and it would give them the opportunity to divide and conquer. So I do believe that the 57th Motorized Brigade is located in the southern portion. I will try to look for more sources to corroborate all the troop positions so I can make sure that I'm the most accurate as I can. But if they are all isolated, then they could be turned into like these cauldrons, like the Wagner Group has been doing in other towns. And they would either just be totally decimated or they'd be forced to retreat across the river. So that's what I see happening at the moment. The Wagner Group has also been advancing through some of the more dense parts of Bakhmut along this main road over here, where you have some government buildings, some kindergartens, some other educational facilities, apartment buildings, stores. And those are higher up. Maybe they're 4 stories if you look on Google Earth. And so all of those are being cleared out right now. There's still that Ukrainian bulge, although it has been reduced in size. The Ukrainians are still holding out there for as long as possible to prevent the Russians from going forward with their plans to cut off the different sections of eastern Bakhmut. Then if we go up, we could see that the Russians are trying to assault this meat processing plant. Now, the interesting thing about this meat processing plant is that apparently it's connected to an underground facility that is similar to the salt mines in a way, because it's tens of or maybe dozens of meters underground, and there are apparently mines there. There are apparently some sort of industrial facilities underground, and those are connected with the facilities, or it's connected with the land under the western part of Bakhmut as well. So this entire like underground sort of quote-unquote fortress, this is roughly its perimeter over here, and it is possible that you have Ukrainian troops that are trying to hide in here whenever there's an artillery barrage, or maybe they're stockpiling on weapons over here to make sure that the Russians are not able to effectively advance. So that's something to look out for as the Russians try to assault the meat processing plant, because a lot of people would have expected it to fall already, because it is basically enveloped on 2 sides, maybe even 3 sides by now. But the Ukrainians have been able to hold out because it is a very complicated network of defensive fortifications in the specific area, which makes it difficult to assault it head on. So instead, the Russians are bypassing it, trying to assault some of the less dense residential buildings as they continue to reach the Bakhmutovka River. But again, most of the activity is going on the flanks, as I've said before. They've continued to advance in the Stupka district, which is the northernmost district of Bakhmut. The Russians have been able to dislodge the 17th Tank Brigade from some of their forward positions, and we'll see what happens over here. But again, the more important update is around Berkivka, where last time that I talked, I was saying that the Russians were trying to assault it, but instead of just assaulting it head on, they tried to flank it by attacking this open field in between the town of Berkivka and Yahidny. So they sort of tried to create a wedge in between the different Ukrainian groupings. And so this is roughly how that looked like. And they were able to take a sizable chunk of Yahidny, but the Ukrainians sent in reinforcements and stabilized the front line. And as a result, the Russians lost some of the land that they had taken in Yahidny. But as a result, they were able to create a cauldron that isolated the Ukrainian formations in Berkivka. So instead of being encircled, which is sort of the case like in Krasnohor or Parskivka, they just retreated to the town of Dubovo-Vasilivka. Now, the issue is that Dubovo-Vasilivka is located on the same valley as Berkivka. And so the Russians do still have the high ground control. The high ground and the hills that I'm talking about are around here in the circle. So the Russians could fire maybe some mortars, maybe some sniper fire, machine gun fire, anti-tank guided missiles, onto the Ukrainians over here. And they could also fire onto the road leading into the town, which means that resupply for the Ukrainian formations over here is very, very difficult. And there's no other way to supply Dubovo-Vasilivka besides this one road over here. And so I don't expect the Ukrainians to remain in this town for very long. Again, it's turning into another one of those Berkivka or Parskivka situations where they're being developed on all sides. And so I do expect them to retreat to maybe Orokovo, Vasilivka, maybe Hrihorivka. I know a lot of Ukrainian units have been retreating to Bohdanivka, where they're setting up new defensive fortifications. You have some of these units that I'm presuming are already in the town. I don't know for sure they are, but it would just make sense logically for them to go over here because it is near the Donbass water canal, which is going to be Ukraine's next line of defense because it is adjacent to Chasiv Yar and it is on high ground. And so I do expect them to continue to build up defenses in this town as the situation deteriorates in Bakhmut and its surroundings. And so if you want to look at a topographic map of the situation, just to visualize everything, here you can see. So the front line, it looks roughly like this, and so the Russians, they are going to be able to advance through this valley over here. You see all this blue, try to advance through this valley and reach the town of Hromove. So the town of Hromove is over here. You see Hromove is in a valley, but the issue is that Ukrainians control this key hill to the north of Hromove, which allows them to overlook the town of Hromove and the valley around Yahidny, which means that the Wagner group, as they're going to try to advance, the Ukrainians will obviously try to fire upon them. Now, the contrast isn't that large, and the Wagner group could just assault Hromove from the east directly if they're able to advance more into Bakhmut. But either way, it will make it more difficult to take the town head on. And so the Wagner group, they may try to dislodge the Ukrainians from this hill. I don't know what's going to happen, but it doesn't seem like that big of a threat. I'm just putting it out there for all the people interested in the geography. Now, if we go to Bohdanivka, you see that it is located on the same valley as Berkivka, but on all the sides surrounding Bohdanivka, there is very high ground, that's crazy, 715 feet. Look at that. Over here, it's nearly 800 feet. And this means that even if the Ukrainians are in a valley, they are receiving artillery and fire support from the higher ground. So assaulting Bohdanivka would become a death trap for the Wagner group if they don't secure their flanks. If we go to the town of Orokovo, Vasilivka, then that town is also on the same valley, which means that the Russians do have control of the high ground to the north of it. And so they're going to be able to squeeze the Ukrainians out like they did in Berkivka, and they will do, I presume, in Dubovo-Vasilivka. But the difference is that now the Ukrainians also have control of the high ground to the west around the water canal, and so they might be able to provide some support for the Ukrainian formations over here. Again, what Ukraine is trying to do is just hold out for as long as possible until they get more shipments of aid from the west to refill their stockpiles of ammunition and to get some of the needed supplies, whether it be vehicles or shells or other such equipment like anti-tank equipment, javelins. They're just trying to do it for as much as possible until they're able to receive new supplies and until they're able to build up a new defensive line that will sort of repeat the process of Russia grinding through and incurring casualties in the process, and Ukraine just trying to hold out attritionally. So that's what we're seeing going on right now. So I'm going to move back to the map. This is the situation. Before I end the video, I want to remind everybody about the situation around Zalizhnyansk and Vasyukivka, because it seems like the Wagner Group has diverted their attention from the Seversk front towards the Bakhmut front because this is where they're having the most success. But despite that fact, we are receiving reports that the Russians are probing the line around this this new valley that the Ukrainians have tried to dig in at, and they are trying to really see the full extent of the Ukrainian defenses over here to see whether they're strong enough to hold. If there was some sort of frontal assault, if there was a frontal assault, then it could really prove catastrophic for Ukraine, because this entire area in between the E40 highway and the road into Vasyukivka, it really is just open land, pretty low elevation, and they will be able to cut off some of the supply lines leading into the front line. They may be able to really reach deep into the Ukrainian rear in areas that would leave the Seversk grouping exposed and could create a really massive cauldron, which would include Seversk, Zvanivka, and some of these other towns where you have large Ukrainian groupings, and could also threaten a town like Alexandrivka, which is a pretty important logistical hub. So that's what I'm seeing as of today. That's the situation. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.